Hello book lovers, welcome to Uncommon Reader. My name is Daniela. In today's video, I want to focus on an author that really made an impact on me as a reader. Her name is Azar Nafisi, best known for her novel Reading Lolita in Tehran. The Italian version is here with me. And I had the pleasure to see her in person during a local book festival here in my region in Italy last month. And I have her autograph on my copy of Reading Lolita in Tehran. And look how adorable this woman is. She wrote her name and she wrote it in Persian as well. And she drew a flower and the date. So thoughtful. I really didn't want to trouble her spelling my Italian name, so I just asked her, just write your name. And so she wrote her name on my copy of Reading Lolita in Tehran, but also on the copy of the book I'm going to focus today, which is Read Dangerously, her latest book. I'm also going to share a couple of segments from an interview she gave during the event where she speaks about the inspiration behind this book and also how influential her dad was in her love for literature. The two segments will be interrupted by a couple of applauses because Nafisi was, of course, responding in English. And she took a while to realize that there was an interpreter that had to translate in Italian. And we shared a few moments like this a few times because she was just loving to talk and to share her experience and thoughts that she would always forget about the interpreter. So let's start with those two segments and then I'll be back talking about Read Dangerously and all its contents because it's filled with inspiring books and authors.
To be in Italy, which is part of my republic of imagination. Every time I come here, I start speaking with my heart rather than anywhere else. So thank you for being who you are. And thank you. Ask you, how come you wrote this book? Well, it's like falling in love. You know, the first time you see someone and you become sort of obsessed with them, you get up at night and think, oh, he has this other quality that I like very much. And so for me, the question was that the writing had to come from my heart. I didn't want to write an academic essay on these writers that I talk about. I wanted to tell people how I felt about them. And I believe that literature, great literature, is about the head, but more than the head, it's about the heart. And so I thought, what am I going to do? I want to talk to someone about this. Most of my books are conversations. And I wanted this to be a conversation between me and some other person, and at the same time be a conversation between fiction and reality. So my father, ever since I was 3 years old, would tell me stories. And he was very democratic in the way he told his stories. One night we went to England with Alice. The second night we went to ancient Persia with Ferdowsi, then to America with Charlotte's Web, to Denmark with Little Match Girl, and of course, Pinocchio. So there were several lessons I learned from this. The fact was that every night he transported me to another world. And I realized that by reading, in my case at that time by listening to stories, oh, I'm so sorry, it's his fault. When my father told me these stories was that I can stay in my little room in Tehran and the whole world will come to me. That is what reading does. It connects not just to itself or to ourselves, but it connects to the world. And literature, this Republic of Imagination, is the only space that surpasses, transcends the limitations that reality places upon us, imposes upon us. Literature transcends the limitations of nationality, language, religion, ethnicity, gender, race, and it creates a whole community of readers and writers who become intimate strangers to one another.
Okay, time to dive into Read Dangerously now. I loved how this book was structured. As Nafisi was saying, she structured it in a few chapters, and each chapter is a letter to her dad, which was such an important figure in her life. Think that they would exchange letters when she was abroad studying in England, and then when she left as well Iran to go to study university in USA. But they would write each other's letters even when they were living under the same roof. So I find that so romantic, and I envy this bond she had with her dad. So I actually read the book in Italian, and I took a few notes so I can share with you, because I translated a few elements of the book. As I said, is it structured in little chapters, and I guess I can show you. It would be probably the same, at least the names of the authors. So she doesn't call them chapters, she calls them letters. And she wrote this book while the pandemic was going on in 2019, 2020. And although I did have a lot of notes here, I am just going to briefly summarize what the chapters are, because they're not only focusing on different writers, but also on different topics. And let's start with actually a quote from Heinrich Heine, who was a German Jewish writer that she mentions in the introduction of this book, which is quite the essence of this book. Where they burn books, they will ultimately burn people too. So you can figure out what this book is about. It's about the importance of books, of writing, of reading, importance of freedom of speech, of thought. On the first letter to her dad, she mentions a few writers. And the focus of the chapter is definitely the importance of books, and also she mentions a few banned books, for example, The Satanic Verses by Salman Rushdie, and she goes into deep talking about what happened when Ayatollah Khomeini banned this book, but also tried to persecute the author of this book, and her frustration for not being able to express her indignation over what was happening. She also speaks a lot about The Republic by Plato. I need to read this book because some parts of what she was saying were a little confusing to me. She was talking about, of course, the ideas of Plato, of Socrates. So it was quite interesting as an historical point of view. Another author she mentions in this letter is Ray Bradbury with his Fahrenheit 451. And guess what? This book has made my November TBR, so I'm going to be reading this book. And look forward, because this is a dystopian story where books are the most dangerous objects in the world. Books don't know borders and limits. They instill new desires and unexpected passion, and they create more questions than answers. a world that is a threat for a totalitarian regime. Nafisi says, when we stop thinking, we stop participating. So we should always try to think with our heads. And then she shares a quote by Bradbury. Books are at the center of our lives. Our brain is our library. Without a library, civilization does not exist. How deep. The second chapter or letter in Read Dangerously focuses on racism, and the two authors Nafisi explores are Zora Neale Hurston and Toni Morrison. And she explains how their books and their stories are sort of a claim and avenge for all the injustices that have been perpetrated to African Americans. And also, she explains how living under Iran, a totalitarian regime, made her fully understand these authors' stories and their protagonists. And some of the books I'm going to mention now, so maybe you get curious to read them, as I am. And of Hurston, she mentions her biography, Dust Trucks on a Road. And also, Their Eyes Were Watching God. By Toni Morrison, she mentions, of course, Beloved and The Bluest Eyes. And then she narrates a little bit about also the protagonists of these books and how the two women relate to each other and their freedom of expression. So it's a very touching chapter. The third letter focuses on the situation in the Middle East, the ongoing situation in the Middle East, voicing authors like David Grossman, who is an Israeli writer and political activist, a progressive figure inside the conflict between the Israeli and Arabic wars. He's also kind of critical of the Israeli politics relating to the occupation of Palestine, but also quite opposed to their leadership. Books Nafisi mentions about Grossman is To the End of the Land, and an essay he wrote called The Art of Writing in the Darkness of War. And here's a quote by Grossman I like. I write, I free myself from one of the ambiguous and characteristic vocations of the state of war in which I live, that of being an enemy, only and exclusively an enemy. Another author I was happy to meet, because I have never heard of him, is Elliot Hackerman, who is an American author and former Marine Corps Special Operation Team Leader. He's actually a contemporary writer, and he's been 2 times fighting in Afghanistan and 5 times in Iraq. He wrote a novel called Green on Blue, and then he wrote a biography released in 2019 called Places and Names on War, Revolution, and Returning. And this is, of course, about his experiences of war. What caught my attention about the story of Hackerman was that he's very curious about the enemy, and it feels like he really wants to know, he has the desire to know them better as persons. And in Places and Names, he writes about an encounter he had with an ex-Al-Qaeda terrorist who wanted to meet him. And here's a quote by Hackerman. He says, maybe, like me, he's tired of always dwelling on the things that divide us. Maybe he wants to focus on the things that unite us. And Nafisi says about these authors, they represent a ritual cleansing of the soul. Dehumanizing the enemy is the very nature of war. A story, instead, gives voice to the enemy, forces us to consider him as a human being, to look him in the eye, and thanks to this process, we reaffirm our humanity. In this chapter, there's another author that she mentioned, and is Elias Khoury. He's a Lebanese novelist and intellectual. And so this is another book that caught my attention, and I want to read it pretty soon. Winner of the Palestine Prize, Gate of the Sun. And Nafisi defines this book as intrinsic poetic and narrated by a doctor who lives in a refugee camp outside Beirut. Imagine the stories. In her fourth letter, Nafisi talks to her dad about Margaret Atwood, and we talk more about totalitarian regimes. And the book in question by Margaret Atwood is The Handmaid's Tale. The similarities, again, once more, with the dystopic war of Gilead in the book and Iran, and the tendency as well here of the Trump presidency, because when she wrote this book, Trump was president. So she will also talk a little bit at what she doesn't like about the Trump presidency. And so she gets into deep as well of an article that Atwood wrote for the New York Times in 2017 on the significance of the Handmaid's Tale in Trump's era. I would love to read that article. Maybe we can find it online. And if I do, I'll share a link. So she confirms that the events in the book, The Handmaid's Tale, are based actually on true facts. Some she witnessed in Eastern Europe, and some are, of course, from the Second World War. Atwood mentions how Gilead is actually built on the roots of 1600 Puritanism. And Nafisi explains in detail how Gilead actually reflects the Islamic Republic of Iran, which is a theocracy like Gilead, where citizens are ruled by a divine power and controlled with the extreme violence and terror. Both republics persecute women and minorities. And also, she briefly touches the laws that were changed once the Ayatollah Khomeini came into power after the Iranian Revolution in 1979. So they had these law marriages where the women needed to be 18 years old to get married. The Ayatollah Khomeini lowered that age to 9 years old. Just imagine. Then there were some activists that protested quite heavily, and so they raised the bar to 13. Still way too young, would you say? Yeah, this is a topic that really makes me mad. The child marriage issue is something I'm deeply disturbed by. And I'm going to leave this chapter with one last quote from Atwood from her New York Times article. And it's this beautiful definition of her novel being a genre called testimonial literature, which I feel it's the most important type of literature, because we hear stories that really happened, and we are witnesses of history. I personally feel like those books touch my soul in such a way that they become really unforgettable. I don't know if it happens to you, but sometimes, I read a novel and then, 2 years later, I totally forget what it was about. But if I read a real story, somehow it will stick in my brain and I won't be able to forget it. The fifth letter of Nafisi to her dad speaks about, again, racism, human rights, and gay rights. And this figure, which I did know again, and I look forward to read some of the books Nafisi mentions. There are quite a lot from this author she particularly admires. And I'm talking about James Baldwin, an African-American writer and civil rights activist. He's one of the leading voices of the African-American experience. And although Baldwin spent almost all of his adult life in France, his writing always addresses the complexities of the heart of America, viewed through the lens of a consummate outsider. So a few books she mentions, If Beale Street Could Talk, from 1974, which actually was made into a movie in 2018. No, did you watch it? Do you know about it? The other book she mentions is from 1963, The Fire Next Time, and then a collection of his works, The Price of the Ticket. And then Nafisi also speaks more about this author's life and how he witnessed very tumultuous decades of civil rights from the 50s to the 70s. So Nafisi mentions other books from him. And of course, I'm just mentioning books here, but in Read Dangerously, Nafisi explains what the book is about and how, of course, it's important in terms of being one of those testimonial literature we so care about. She mentions a quote by Baldwin, which is quite beautiful. Ignorance, allied with power, is the most ferocious enemy that justice can encounter. So true. There was another author that she mentions in this final letter to her dad. It's Ta-Nehisi Coates. He's born 1975, so he's a contemporary American author, journalist, and activist. He writes about cultural, social, political issues, particularly regarding African American and the white supremacy. She mentions a book from him, published in 2015, called Between the World and Me. This book is dedicated to his 15-year-old son, inspired actually by an article Baldwin published in 1962. And so this is kind of a recap of what the book is about, the main core of the narration, but there's so much more other authors and mentions here and there, and so many of her reflection and personal stories as well that she narrates from her time spent in Iraq when she was working. And if you are interested in learning more about when she was a literary professor at the Tehran University, you must read Reading Lolita in Tehran. I want to end this video with a quote by Baldwin again, and this is from 1984. When I was a kid, the world was white, while now it fights to stay white. Quite a difference. Well, I don't know about you, but to me the world should be the color of the rainbow, many colors, many cultures, and it would be great that we could enrich each other with our differences and try to get along. I don't know, why is it so complicated? Well, let me know what you think about these authors. Do you have others you want to recommend that could be labeled as testimonial literature? So I look forward to discuss this with you in the comments. And thank you so much for watching this video today. I look forward to see you back here on Uncommon Reader next week. In the meantime, happy reading. Ciao!